The scream came before the sound of the fall finished echoing across the water. Nathaniel Hale went off the edge of the western dock at 6:15 in the evening, and by the time 2 dock workers pulled him from the cold river, his chest had stopped moving twice. Blood ran from a wound above his ear, thick and dark against the wet stone. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing anything. The men who carried him up the hill to Hale Manor were certain, in their bones, that they were carrying a dead man home to be buried, not healed. The house came alive with panic the moment they arrived. Servants ran with towels and hot water. A boy was sent on horseback to fetch the doctor. Lady Constance Hale stood frozen in the doorway of her son's bedroom, one hand pressed against her mouth, watching as they laid his broken body onto white sheets that were already turning red. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his coat still damp from riding through the rain. He examined the wound on Nathaniel's skull with careful, practiced hands, then straightened and looked at the family gathered outside the door. He said the young master might not survive the night. If he did survive, the doctor added quietly, there was no promise he would ever open his eyes again. Word spread through the manor like fire through dry grass. By morning, half the staff had already begun packing their belongings. Nobody wanted to stay in a house waiting for death to finish its work. Wages meant nothing if there was no master left to pay them, and no one wished to spend their days listening to a dying man breathe. Only one person did not pack a single bag. Eleanor Finch was the youngest maid in the house, barely 19, assigned to the kitchens and the laundry, a girl whose name most of the family had never bothered to learn. She had grown up poor, in a house with empty cupboards and a father who drank away whatever coins came through the door. She knew what it meant to watch someone suffer while everyone around them looked away. When the housekeeper told the remaining staff that anyone willing could volunteer to sit with the young master through the night, no one stepped forward. Eleanor did. The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a scullery maid would offer to sit beside a man who was likely to die before sunrise. She did not ask. She only nodded and told Eleanor to fetch clean cloths and a basin of water. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the dim candlelight beside Nathaniel Hale's bed. His face was pale as the sheets beneath him. His breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one sounding as though it might be his last. She dipped a cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against his forehead. She did not know this man. She had passed him in the hallways a handful of times, always with her eyes down, always careful not to be noticed. He was the kind of man born into a world she would never belong to, a world of silk waistcoats and shipping contracts and dinners with silver on every plate. And yet here she was, alone with him in the dark, the only person in the entire house who had chosen to stay. The hours passed slowly. Somewhere below, she could hear the muffled voices of the family, tense and low, discussing arrangements no family should have to discuss so soon. She heard the word funeral spoken once, quickly hushed, as though saying it too loudly might make it true. Eleanor kept wringing the cloth, kept pressing it to his skin, kept watching his chest rise and fall, terrified that at any moment it might simply stop. Near midnight, Dr. Whitmore returned to check on his patient. He looked at Eleanor with something between surprise and sympathy. He told her gently that she did not need to keep doing this, that there was little a maid could do that medicine had not already tried, that she should get some rest and let nature take its course. Eleanor did not answer him with words. She simply dipped the cloth again and continued her work. The doctor left without arguing further. By dawn, Nathaniel had not died. He had also not woken. His body remained locked in that strange, terrible place between the living and the gone, a place with no clear road leading out of it. The physicians called it a deep sleep of the mind, brought on by the injury to his skull. They admitted they had seen men wake from such conditions after a day. They had also seen men remain that way for years, their bodies breathing on and on while whatever made them who they were simply never returned. Lady Constance could not bear to sit at her son's bedside for more than a few minutes at a time. Every time she looked at his still face, she saw the small boy he had once been, and the grief was too heavy to carry. She retreated to her private rooms and left instructions that she be informed the moment anything changed, for better or for worse. His brother, Edmund Hale, handled the situation differently. Where his mother wept, Edmund calculated. He was 2 years older than Nathaniel and had spent most of his life standing exactly one step behind him, watching their father's shipping company, their father's fortune, and their father's approval all flow toward his younger brother instead of himself. Now, with Nathaniel lying broken and silent in his bed, Edmund found himself walking the halls of the estate with new interest, studying the ledgers in the study, speaking with the company's business partners, as though the role already belonged to him. He was not cruel about it. He simply seemed, to anyone watching closely, like a man rehearsing for a part he expected to be given very soon. Eleanor noticed this, though she said nothing. It was not her place to speak on such matters. Her place, as far as anyone in the house was concerned, was in the kitchens and the laundry room, not in the sick room of a gentleman who might never wake at all. And yet she returned to that sick room every single night. She brought fresh water. She changed the cloths on his forehead. She read to him from an old book of poems she had found on the shelf, not because she believed he could hear her, but because the silence in that room was unbearable otherwise, and speaking into it felt better than drowning in it. She told him about the weather outside his window. She told him about the cook's terrible temper, and about the stray cat that kept sneaking into the pantry, and about nothing important at all, because nothing important felt safer to speak aloud than the things that actually mattered. Some nights she simply held his hand, the way she imagined someone might have held her own mother's hand, if anyone had bothered to sit with her mother during the long illness that eventually took her away. Eleanor had been only 12 years old then, too small and too poor to do anything but watch from a doorway as her mother slipped further from the world, alone in a room nobody entered until it was already too late. She had promised herself, in the quiet grief that followed, that she would never again stand by and let someone fade away untouched and unheard, not while she had breath in her own body to prevent it. Nathaniel Hale had no idea any of this was happening. He existed somewhere far beyond the walls of that bedroom, in a gray and formless place where time moved strangely and nothing held its shape for long. He could not have said in that place whether hours or days or weeks were passing. He could not have said whether he was dying or simply lost. All he knew, in whatever fragment of himself remained aware, was that somewhere far away, a voice kept speaking to him, steady, familiar, refusing to stop. Days turned into a full week, then 2. The household began to settle into an uneasy rhythm around the tragedy, the way people always do when grief refuses to resolve itself quickly. The black curtains that had been hastily ordered for a funeral remained folded in a closet, unused but not yet returned, a quiet reminder that death was still considered the most likely outcome. Some of the staff who had left in the first panic began quietly asking whether they might return to their positions. Word had reached them that the young master, though still unconscious, had stabilized. His fever had broken. His wounds were healing slowly beneath careful bandaging. Whatever fight remained inside him had not yet given up. The housekeeper allowed a few of them back, though she watched them with narrowed eyes, well aware that their sudden loyalty had more to do with wages than with genuine concern. Eleanor said nothing about any of it. She was not interested in credit or recognition. She simply kept returning, night after night, to the same chair beside the same bed, continuing a vigil that nobody had asked her to keep and that she had no intention of abandoning. On the 14th night, as she sat reading quietly from her worn book of poems, she noticed something she had not noticed before. His fingers moved. Only slightly, only for a moment. But there, against the white sheet, his hand had curled just barely, as though reaching towards something it could not quite find. Alina set down her book at once and leaned closer, her heart suddenly pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She watched his face for any other sign, any flicker of movement, any change at all. For a long, breathless moment, nothing else happened. His hand lay still again. His chest rose and fell in the same slow rhythm it always had. But she had seen it. She was certain she had seen it. She reached out and gently placed her own hand over his, the way she had done many nights before, and she spoke softly into the quiet room, telling him that she was there, that he was not alone, that whatever was pulling at him from wherever he had gone, he did not have to follow it all the way down. She did not know if he could hear her. She had no way of knowing what, if anything, remained inside that still and silent body. But somewhere in the gray and formless place where Nathaniel Hale had been lost for 2 weeks, something had shifted. A single point of light, faint and distant, had appeared in the endless fog around him. It was not bright. It was not close. But it was there, steady and unmoving, exactly where it had always been. And for the first time since the night he fell from the dock into the cold, dark water, some small, buried part of him had begun, very slowly, to move toward it. The movement of his hand became the first crack of hope in a house that had almost given up entirely. Alina told no one at first. She was afraid that if she spoke the words aloud, she might discover she had imagined the whole thing, that grief and exhaustion had tricked her tired eyes into seeing something that was never really there. So she kept watching, night after night, waiting to see if it would happen again. On the 16th night it did. His fingers twitched against the sheet, then curled slightly around her own hand, as though searching for something solid to hold onto. This time there was no mistaking it. Alina sat perfectly still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might break whatever fragile thread was pulling him back toward the world. She finally told the housekeeper the next morning, her voice careful and quiet, half expecting to be dismissed as foolish. Instead, the housekeeper's face went pale, and within the hour, Dr. Whitmore had been sent for again. The doctor examined Nathaniel with fresh urgency, checking his eyes, his pulse, the response of his limbs to gentle pressure. He confirmed what Alina already knew. The young master was still deeply unconscious, but something inside him had changed. His body was no longer simply surviving. It was beginning, in small and uncertain ways, to fight its way back. The news spread through the house quickly, and with it came a change in the atmosphere that Alina found almost as unsettling as the grief that had come before it. Suddenly, people who had barely glanced toward the sick room in 2 weeks were finding reasons to walk past its door. Suddenly, staff who had quietly begun preparing for a funeral were speaking instead of celebration, of relief, of the young master's remarkable strength. Lady Constance wept when she heard, but this time the tears were different, lighter somehow, though still edged with fear that the improvement might not last. She sat beside her son for the first time in days, holding his other hand, speaking softly to him in a way she had been too frightened to attempt before. Edmund Hale received the news in the study, standing over the same ledgers he had been studying with quiet interest for 2 weeks. He did not smile. He did not weep. He simply closed the book in front of him, set it aside, and asked, in a voice that gave away nothing at all, how long the doctor believed it might take before his brother woke fully, if he woke at all. Nobody had an answer for him. Nobody had an answer for any of it. The body could heal in ways no physician fully understood, and there was no way to predict whether Nathaniel would open his eyes tomorrow, or in a month, or never. Alina continued her nightly vigil, though the room around her had changed. It was no longer the quiet, forgotten corner of the house it had been during the first 2 weeks. Now people came and went throughout the day, checking on him, whispering near the door, treating his continued survival as something almost miraculous. But when night fell and the rest of the house settled into sleep, it was still Alina who sat in the chair beside his bed, still Alina whose voice filled the silence with poems and small, unimportant stories. She noticed, as the days went on, that his movements were becoming slightly more frequent. A twitch of his fingers here, a faint furrow of his brow there, as though some distant part of him was working through a difficult thought. Once, in the middle of a quiet evening, his lips moved slightly, shaping a word that never fully formed into sound. She leaned close each time these small signs appeared, whispering encouragement, telling him he was doing well, that he only needed to keep moving toward the light, whatever that meant to him in the strange place he was trapped inside. It was during this time that Edmund began to take a closer interest in Alina herself. At first, it was simple curiosity, the kind any member of the household might show toward a servant who had suddenly become the center of attention. But as the days passed, his questions grew sharper, more pointed. He wanted to know why a kitchen maid was spending so many hours in his brother's private rooms. He wanted to know what she said to him during those long nights. He wanted to know what she hoped to gain from all of this devotion. Alina answered honestly each time, telling him simply that she had chosen to stay when others had chosen to leave, and that she expected nothing in return for it. Her answers did not seem to satisfy him. Edmund had spent his entire life in a world where nothing was given without expectation of something in return, and he could not fully believe that anyone, especially someone with as little as Alina had, would offer such devotion without calculating some eventual reward. He began speaking to the housekeeper about the matter, suggesting, in careful and measured tones, that it might be improper for a maid of Alina's station to spend so much unsupervised time alone with a gentleman of the house, conscious or not. He suggested that perhaps her duties should be reassigned, that another member of staff, someone older, someone more suited to the role, might take over the nightly watch instead. The housekeeper, to her credit, resisted these suggestions at first. She reminded Edmund that Alina had been the only person willing to stay when the rest of the household abandoned the sick room entirely, and that it seemed a strange time to punish her for loyalty rather than reward it. Edmund did not press the matter further, not yet, but Alina noticed the way his eyes followed her now when she crossed the halls, calculating, weighing, as though trying to determine exactly what threat she might pose to whatever future he had begun quietly planning for himself. She tried not to let his suspicion trouble her. She had far greater concerns occupying her mind each night as she sat beside Nathaniel's bed, watching for any further sign of progress, terrified that the small improvements she had witnessed might simply stop, leaving him suspended forever in that unreachable place between sleeping and waking. 3 weeks after the accident, on a night when a storm rattled the windows and rain fell in heavy sheets against the glass, Nathaniel's eyes opened for the first time. It happened without warning, without any of the build-up Alina might have expected after weeks of small, gradual signs. One moment his face was as still and peaceful as it had been every night before. The next, his eyelids fluttered, then parted, revealing eyes that were unfocused, confused, searching the dim candlelight of the room without understanding. Alina froze for only a heartbeat before springing into action, calling out for the housekeeper, for anyone, her voice cutting sharply through the sound of the storm outside. Within minutes, the room was filled with people, servants carrying fresh candles. Dr. Whitmore hastily summoned once again, Lady Constance rushing in with her dressing gown still loosely tied, tears already forming before she had even fully understood what was happening. Nathaniel's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the unfamiliar faces gathered around his bed, the flickering candlelight, the storm-darkened window. He did not speak. He did not seem, at first, to understand any of what he was seeing. Dr. Whitmore leaned close, speaking his name gently, asking if he could hear him, asking if he understood where he was. Nathaniel's gaze drifted slowly around the crowded room, past his mother's tear-streaked face, past his brother standing rigid near the doorway, past the unfamiliar faces of servants he could not place. And then his eyes settled and stayed on Alina, standing quietly near the foot of the bed, her hands still trembling from the shock of what she had just witnessed. Something in his expression shifted, softened, as though some fragment of familiarity had finally been found in a room otherwise full of strangers. He did not know her name. He could not have explained, even to himself, why her face felt different from all the others surrounding him. But something in the sound of a voice he could not quite remember hearing, something in the shape of a presence that had somehow followed him through the darkness, told him that this was the one person in the room he already, somehow, trusted. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, broken whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Nobody in the room understood the word at first. Dr. Whitmore leaned even closer, asking him to repeat himself. Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on Alina as he tried again, forcing the sound past a throat that had not been used in weeks. The word, when it finally came clear enough to understand, was simple. He was asking who had been staying with him. The room fell silent. Lady Constance turned slowly to look at Alina, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. Edmund's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. The housekeeper stepped forward, gently explaining that it was Alina, one of the kitchen maids who had refused to leave his side through every night of his long sleep. Nathaniel's eyes remained on her a moment longer, and though he was still too weak and too disoriented to say anything further, something passed between them in that silent exchange that neither of them would forget in the days and weeks that followed. He drifted back into sleep only minutes later, exhausted by the effort of simply opening his eyes and speaking a single word. But this time, everyone in the room understood the difference. This was not the same unreachable sleep he had been trapped inside for 3 weeks. This was ordinary rest, the kind any recovering body needed, the kind that would end, eventually, in a true and lasting waking. Dr. Whitmore assured the family that this was an extraordinarily positive sign, though he cautioned that full recovery would likely take weeks, perhaps longer. There would be confusion. There might be gaps in memory. The mind, after such a severe injury, did not simply return all at once, fully intact, the way people wished it might. As the room slowly emptied and the excitement began to settle into quiet relief, Edmund lingered near the doorway, watching Alina as she resumed her seat beside the bed, watching the way Nathaniel's hand, even in sleep, remained loosely curled around hers. He said nothing that night, but the look on his face made it clear that whatever plans he had quietly been building over the past 3 weeks would now need to be reconsidered, and that he did not intend to let a kitchen maid stand in the way of whatever future he still believed belonged to him. News of the young master's waking spread through the county within days, carried by carriage drivers and market vendors, and the endless chain of servants who moved between grand houses carrying gossip along with deliveries. Families who had sent no word during the 3 weeks of his suffering now sent cards of congratulation. Business partners who had quietly begun exploring arrangements with Edmund, instead now wrote letters expressing their relief and their eagerness to continue working directly with Nathaniel once he was well enough. Inside the house, however, recovery proved far slower and more difficult than the joyful news traveling outward might have suggested. Nathaniel drifted in and out of clear awareness for many days after that first waking. Some hours he seemed almost entirely himself, able to speak in full sentences, able to recognize faces and answer simple questions. Other hours he would stare blankly at the ceiling, unable to remember where he was or why his body ached in every joint, unable even to recall the names of servants he had known his entire life. Dr. Whitmore visited daily, monitoring these fluctuations with careful notes, explaining patiently to the family each time that this was normal, that the mind healed unevenly after such trauma, that patience was the only real medicine left to offer. Through all of it, Alina remained a constant presence. She no longer sat alone with him through the night, not since his waking had drawn so much attention to her role, but she was still there each morning, bringing his meals, helping him with small tasks his weakened body could not yet manage on its own, speaking to him in the same steady, familiar tone she had used throughout his 3 weeks of silence. Nathaniel found, in the confusing days that followed his waking, that her voice was one of the few things that felt entirely solid to him. Faces blurred together. Names slipped from his memory almost as soon as he heard them. But when Alina spoke, something in him settled, as though her voice belonged to a part of his memory that the injury had not managed to touch. He asked her once, during a rare clear afternoon, why she had stayed with him when so many others had left. He did not remember any of the 3 weeks himself, not consciously, but something in him carried the weight of it anyway, a strange certainty that she had been there through all of it, even if he could not recall a single detail. Alina considered the question carefully before answering. She told him only that she knew what it was like to be left alone when it mattered most, and that she had decided long ago never to let that happen to someone else if she had any choice in the matter. She did not elaborate further, and Nathaniel did not press her. But the answer stayed with him, turning over quietly in his healing mind in the days that followed, a small piece of her history offered without explanation, understood without needing one. As Nathaniel's clarity improved, so did the tension surrounding him. Edmund had spent 3 weeks growing accustomed to a version of the household in which he held quiet, growing authority, and he found himself unwilling to release that authority easily now that his brother was recovering. He began inserting himself more forcefully into business matters, making decisions on Nathaniel's behalf before Nathaniel was even fully aware such decisions needed to be made, signing correspondence with his own name, where his brother's name had always appeared before. When Nathaniel discovered some of these changes during a clearer afternoon, he said little at first, still too weak and too uncertain of his own mind to argue forcefully. But the discomfort between the brothers grew sharper with each passing day, a tension the rest of the household could feel even if nothing was said openly about it. Lady Constance tried to smooth the friction where she could, though her attention was divided between relief at her younger son's survival and quiet worry over the widening distance between her 2 children. She had always known, in some unspoken way, that Edmund carried resentment toward his brother, but she had never before seen it expressed so plainly, in the careful, calculated way he moved through the house now, as though testing exactly how much space he could claim before anyone stopped him. It was Alina's presence, more than anything else, that seemed to draw Edmund's sharpest attention. He began finding reasons to question her constantly, cornering her in hallways to ask what tasks she had performed for his brother that day, what conversations had passed between them, whether she had overheard any discussion of business matters during her time in his room. Alina answered these questions honestly and simply, offering nothing beyond what was asked, careful never to give him any reason to escalate his suspicion further. But Edmund was not a man easily satisfied by simple answers. He began speaking more openly to other members of the staff, suggesting that a maid spending so much time near a vulnerable, recovering gentleman was inappropriate, regardless of how innocent her intentions might appear. He suggested that perhaps she had grown too comfortable in her position, too familiar with a family far above her own station, and that such familiarity rarely ended well for anyone involved. Some of the staff, eager to remain in Edmund's good favor given his growing influence over the household, began repeating these suggestions among themselves, and slowly, quietly, a current of gossip began moving through the servants' quarters, painting Alina's devotion in a far less generous light than it deserved. Alina heard fragments of this gossip herself, catching sideways glances from maids who had once barely acknowledged her existence, noticing conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. She said nothing about it to anyone, carrying the weight of it quietly, the way she had learned to carry most difficult things throughout her life. It reached its breaking point on an afternoon when Edmund summoned her directly to the study, the same room where he had spent so many hours during his brother's unconscious weeks, studying ledgers that were not yet his to study. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told her plainly that her behavior over the past month had drawn unwanted attention to the family, that her constant presence near his brother was beginning to raise questions among their social circle, and that it would be best for everyone involved if she returned fully to her proper duties in the kitchens, with no further involvement in his brother's care. Alina stood quietly through this entire speech, her hands folded in front of her expression giving away nothing of the anger and hurt building beneath the surface. When he finished, she asked him simply whether his brother had requested this change himself. Edmund's jaw tightened at the question. He admitted, after a pause, that his brother had not requested any such thing. Alina told him then, in a voice that remained steady despite the trembling she felt in her own chest, that she would continue her duties exactly as she always had, unless the request came directly from the one person whose recovery she had been trying, with everything she had, to protect. She added, quietly but firmly, that she had not asked for recognition when she stayed beside his brother through 3 weeks that everyone else had abandoned, and she did not intend to ask for permission now to continue caring about the outcome of that recovery. Edmund's expression darkened, though he said nothing further in that moment. He simply watched her leave the study, his mind already turning toward other ways he might remove what he had come to see as an obstacle standing between himself and the future he believed he deserved. That evening, word of the confrontation reached Nathaniel through the housekeeper, who felt it was better he hear the truth from someone loyal than through whatever version his brother might eventually offer. Nathaniel listened carefully, his expression unreadable, and said nothing at first beyond thanking her for the information. Later that night, once the house had quieted and most of the staff had retired, he asked that Alina be brought to his room. She arrived uncertain of what to expect, worried that perhaps Edmund had already succeeded in turning his brother against her in some way. Instead, she found Nathaniel sitting upright in bed, stronger than he had been in days, his eyes clear and focused in a way that told her this was one of his good hours, one of the moments when the fog of his injury had lifted enough to let his true self through. He asked her to sit, and when she did, he told her plainly that he had heard about the conversation in the study. He told her that he did not share his brother's concerns, that he understood far better than anyone else in the house exactly what she had done for him during the weeks he could not remember, weeks that everyone else had treated as a slow countdown toward a funeral that never came. He admitted, with a rare and quiet honesty, that he did not fully understand why her presence had felt so different from everyone else's during those long weeks of darkness, why her voice had been the one thread he seemed to follow back toward waking. He only knew that it had, and that he did not intend to let his brother's suspicion undo whatever debt he owed her because of it. Alina felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she was holding so tightly, a tension built slowly over weeks of quiet gossip and growing hostility. She told him simply that she had never expected anything in return for staying, that she had done it because leaving had never once felt like an option to her, not after everything she had already lost in her own life without anyone choosing to stay for her. The words slipped out before she fully intended them to, a small piece of her own history offered in a moment of unguarded honesty. She did not explain further, and Nathaniel did not ask her to. But something passed between them in that quiet exchange, an understanding built not on pity but on recognition, two people who had each learned in different ways what it cost to be left alone when it mattered most. He told her before she left the room that night that whatever concerns his brother continued to raise, she should ignore them entirely. He assured her that her place in his recovery and in the household more broadly was not something Edmund had any authority to decide. It was a small promise, spoken quietly in a dimly lit room late at night, but it was enough to steady Alina through the difficult weeks that followed, weeks in which Edmund's resentment continued to grow in the shadows, quietly gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to strike at the one obstacle he had not yet found a way to remove. 2 months after the accident, Nathaniel's recovery had reached a point where he could walk short distances on his own, hold full conversations without confusion, and manage light work in his study for an hour or two at a time before exhaustion forced him back to bed. His memory of the accident itself remained a blank space he could not fill, no matter how many times he tried to reconstruct the moment he fell from the dock, and the 3 weeks that followed existed for him only through the accounts of others, second-hand fragments of a period he had lived through without truly experiencing. Despite these gaps, he was, by every measure Dr. Whitmore could offer, a man who had defied every expectation set for him in the first terrible days after his fall. The household began to settle into something resembling its old rhythm, though an undercurrent of tension remained just beneath the surface, one that most of the staff could sense even if they could not name its exact cause. Edmund had grown quieter since his confrontation with Alina and his brother's clear rejection of his concerns, but his quiet was not the quiet of someone who had let a matter go. It was the quiet of someone recalculating. He found his opportunity nearly 3 months after the accident, during a visit from a business associate of the family, a man named Charles Fenwick, who had long maintained shipping contracts with the Hale family, and who had grown increasingly close to Edmund during the weeks Nathaniel lay unconscious. Fenwick arrived at the manor for what was presented as a routine visit to discuss ongoing contracts, but Edmund had arranged the meeting with a different purpose entirely. Over dinner, in front of Lady Constance and a still recovering Nathaniel, Edmund steered the conversation toward matters of the household staff, mentioning, almost casually, that he had noticed certain irregularities in recent months that he felt obligated to raise. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man who had rehearsed his lines many times before delivering them. He suggested that a maid in the household had developed an inappropriate closeness to his brother during his illness, a closeness that had continued even now that Nathaniel was recovering, and that such familiarity between a servant and a gentleman of standing reflected poorly on the family's reputation among their peers. Fenwick, a man deeply concerned with appearances and social standing, seized on the suggestion immediately, asking pointed questions about the maid in question, about her background, about whether such behavior had been addressed. Nathaniel, still weakened but sharp enough to recognize exactly what his brother was attempting, set down his utensils and spoke before his mother could respond. He said plainly that he was aware of the maid Edmund referred to, that her name was Alina Finch, and that she had been the only member of the entire household willing to remain at his side through 3 weeks, when every physician in the county had believed him beyond saving. He added, his voice growing firmer with each word, that whatever closeness existed between them had been earned through devotion that no one else in that house, family or staff, had been willing to offer, and that he found it deeply troubling that his own brother would attempt to twist an act of extraordinary loyalty into something shameful, simply because it did not fit conveniently into his plans. The dinner table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Fenwick, sensing the tension between the brothers, quickly changed the subject, though the damage to the evening's mood had already been done. Lady Constance looked between her 2 sons with an expression of quiet heartbreak, aware now, in a way she had perhaps tried to avoid acknowledging before, of exactly how deep the rift between them had grown. Edmund said nothing further that evening, but the failed attempt seemed only to sharpen his resolve rather than weaken it. In the days that followed, he changed his approach entirely. Rather than attacking Alina directly, he began working more quietly, meeting privately with the family's solicitor, raising questions about the legal standing of certain business decisions made during the weeks Nathaniel had been unconscious, decisions Edmund himself had made on his brother's behalf without formal authority to do so. He argued in these private meetings that given the severity of Nathaniel's injury and the lasting gaps in his memory, there remained legitimate concern about his full mental competency, concern that might justify extending certain protective measures over the family's business affairs, measures that would naturally place more permanent authority in Edmund's hands. The solicitor, a cautious man unwilling to make such determinations lightly, insisted that any question of competency would require formal medical evaluation that Dr. Whitmore, when eventually consulted, refused to support. The doctor stated clearly that while Nathaniel's memory of the accident itself remained affected, his reasoning, judgment, and understanding of his own affairs showed no impairment whatsoever, and that any attempt to suggest otherwise would be, in his professional opinion, entirely without medical basis. Edmund's quiet campaign collapsed under the weight of the doctor's firm assessment, but the attempt itself, once it became known within the family, deepened the wound between the brothers beyond anything that had existed before. Nathaniel confronted Edmund directly once the details reached him, the first true argument between them since the accident, voices raised loud enough that several members of the staff, including Eleanor, overheard fragments of it from the hallway outside the study. She did not linger to listen further, aware that this was not a conversation meant for her ears, but the raised voices left her unsettled for the rest of the evening, worried about what consequences might follow for a family already strained nearly to breaking. The argument ended with no resolution, only a colder, more permanent distance settling between the two brothers, one that no apology in the following days seemed able to fully repair. Edmund began spending less time at the manor itself, taking on business trips that kept him away for stretches of a week or more, a distance that, while easing the immediate tension in the household, did nothing to resolve the deeper resentment still simmering beneath his composed exterior. Through all of this, Eleanor continued her work quietly, trying to remain as unobtrusive as possible, aware that her presence had become, whether she wished it or not, a source of ongoing conflict within a family already fractured by circumstances far beyond her control. She considered, more than once during those difficult weeks, whether it might be easier for everyone if she simply requested a transfer to another household, removing herself entirely from a situation that seemed only to grow more complicated the longer she remained within it. It was Nathaniel who convinced her otherwise, finding her one evening in the small garden behind the kitchen, where she often retreated during rare moments of quiet to sit alone with her thoughts. He had grown strong enough by then to walk the grounds without assistance, though he still tired more easily than he once had before the accident. He told her he had heard, through the housekeeper, that she was considering leaving, and he asked her plainly not to. He acknowledged that his brother's behavior had placed her in an unfair and difficult position, one she had never asked to be part of, and he apologized for the burden his own family's conflict had placed upon her simply because she had chosen, months earlier, to stay when everyone else had walked away. Eleanor admitted, in a rare moment of openness, that she had grown tired of being treated as a threat rather than as a person, that the constant suspicion and quiet hostility had begun wearing at her in ways she found difficult to carry alone, day after day, with no end clearly in sight. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her something he had not yet said aloud to anyone else in the house. He told her that, during his long weeks of unconsciousness, in whatever strange and formless place his mind had wandered, he believed her voice had been the reason he found his way back at all. He could not explain how or why, only that he had felt it in some deep and wordless part of himself, and that he intended to spend whatever time was necessary making certain she never regretted the choice she had made to stay. He asked her, in that quiet garden as evening settled over the manor, to remain not out of obligation, and not simply as a maid attending to household duties, but because he genuinely wished for her to be there, in whatever role she felt comfortable accepting, for as long as she was willing to stay. Eleanor did not answer him immediately. The weight of everything the past 3 months had brought, the exhaustion, the suspicion, the quiet grief of her own past that had driven her to sit beside a dying stranger in the first place, all of it settled over her in that moment, heavy and unresolved. But she did not leave the garden that evening intending to pack her belongings. She stayed instead, watching the last light fade behind the trees, aware that whatever came next for the Hale family and for herself would not be simple and would not come without further struggle. Edmund's resentment had not disappeared, only retreated temporarily, waiting for a new opportunity to resurface. And somewhere beyond the walls of the manor, decisions were already being made that would soon test every fragile piece of trust that had been so carefully rebuilt over the difficult months since the accident. 6 months after the night Nathaniel Hale fell from the western dock, he stood at the head of the long dining table for the first time since his recovery began, calling together his mother, his brother, and the family's solicitor for a conversation he had been quietly preparing for weeks. He had spent those weeks reviewing every decision Edmund had made during his unconscious months, every contract signed, every arrangement adjusted, comparing them carefully against the company's original agreements and his own understanding of their father's wishes. He found in that review a pattern of decisions that were not reckless or dishonest exactly, but that consistently favored positioning Edmund closer to permanent control, decisions made under the cover of necessity that had, in truth, served a purpose far more personal than practical. He did not raise these findings with anger. He had spent too many months learning, from Eleanor's quiet example, that some of the strongest responses came not from the loudest arguments but from calm, unwavering resolve. He explained plainly to his brother, in front of their mother and the solicitor, that he understood the position Edmund had found himself in during those uncertain weeks, forced to make decisions no one had prepared him to make, carrying responsibility that had never truly been his to carry. But he also explained just as plainly that he was now fully recovered, fully capable, and fully aware of what had happened during his absence, and that the company would return, effective immediately, to operating exactly as their father had always intended, with clear and equal transparency between them going forward. Edmund listened to this without interrupting, his expression unreadable through most of it, though something in his posture seemed to loosen slightly by the time his brother finished speaking, as though a weight he had been quietly carrying, the weight of pretending to a role that had never truly fit him, had finally been set down. He admitted, in a rare moment of honesty that surprised everyone at the table including himself, that he had spent most of his life believing their father favored Nathaniel simply because Nathaniel had been born with an ease and confidence that never came naturally to him, and that the accident had offered him, however briefly and however wrongly, a chance to prove he could carry the weight their father had never trusted him to carry. Nathaniel told him, quietly, that he had never once believed their father favored him over Edmund, only that their father had never learned how to show either of them the confidence they each deserved in their own way, and that perhaps it was time the two of them stopped competing for a kind of approval that was no longer theirs to seek. It was not a perfect resolution. Old resentment does not dissolve entirely in a single conversation, no matter how honest. But it was a beginning, the first real conversation the two brothers had shared without hostility since long before the accident, and in the weeks that followed, the distance between them slowly, cautiously, began to close. With that matter settled, Nathaniel turned his attention to something he had been considering for months, since long before his full recovery. Since the first clear night he had understood exactly what Eleanor Finch had done for him during the 3 weeks everyone else believed he was already lost. He requested a private meeting with the family solicitor, separate from the earlier discussion, and presented him with a proposal that startled even a man accustomed to handling unusual family requests. He wished to establish Eleanor as an official partner within the company's operations, not as a token gesture of gratitude, but as a genuine position with real authority and real ownership, recognizing both her role in his survival and, as he had come to discover over the following months, her sharp and capable mind for practical matters that many with far more formal education never developed. The solicitor raised the obvious concerns, the questions of propriety, of how such an arrangement would be perceived by their social circle, of how unusual it would appear for a household maid to suddenly hold standing equal to family members within a respected shipping company. Nathaniel listened to each concern carefully and dismissed none of them as unimportant, but he remained firm in his decision, explaining that he had spent enough of his recovery reflecting on what truly mattered to care very little anymore about the opinions of people who had shown no similar loyalty when it counted. When he brought the proposal to Alina herself, she reacted with the same disbelief the solicitor had shown, insisting that she wanted nothing in return for the choice she had made months earlier, that her decision to stay by his side had never once been about seeking reward. Nathaniel told her, gently but firmly, that he understood this completely, and that this was precisely why he wished to offer it. He explained that gratitude given without expectation deserved recognition given without hesitation, and that he did not intend to let pride, hers or his own family's, stand between doing what he believed was simply right. Alina did not accept immediately. She spent several days considering the offer carefully, aware of how dramatically it would change not only her own position, but the entire structure of the household she had worked within for years. She spoke with the housekeeper, the one person in the manor who had watched her journey from the very first frightened night at Nathaniel's bedside, and the older woman told her simply that she had earned whatever came next, that loyalty, as rare as Alina's, deserved to be met with equally rare generosity, and that she should not let fear of judgment from others rob her of a future she had rightfully earned. In the end, Alina accepted the offer, though she insisted on continuing to learn every aspect of the business from the ground up, rather than accepting the position as an empty title, determined to prove, to herself as much as to anyone else, that she belonged in the role for reasons beyond simple gratitude. The arrangement did draw exactly the kind of attention Nathaniel had expected. Whispers moved through their social circle for weeks, some admiring the unconventional loyalty behind the decision, others scandalized by what they saw as an inappropriate blurring of class and station. Charles Fenwick, the business associate who had once tried to help Edmund undermine Alina's position, withdrew several of his contracts in protest, declaring the arrangement beneath the dignity of a respectable shipping family. Nathaniel accepted the loss of those contracts without hesitation, finding, within a few months, other partners willing to work with a company built on decisions he could stand behind honestly, rather than decisions made purely to satisfy the expectations of people who had never once shown him genuine loyalty when it mattered. Edmund, to the surprise of most who knew him, did not oppose the arrangement once it was finalized. Whatever resentment had once driven him toward undermining Alina's position seemed to have genuinely eased following his honest conversation with his brother, and he found, in the months that followed, a role within the company that suited him far better than the one he had once tried to claim through quiet manipulation, a role focused on the practical management of their shipping routes rather than the broader authority he had once believed he needed to prove his own worth. Lady Constance, though initially uncertain about the unconventional path her younger son had chosen, came in time to see the depth of what had passed between Nathaniel and Alina during those difficult months, understanding, in a way she had perhaps always known but never fully acknowledged, that some bonds are formed not through shared birth or shared circumstance, but through the simple, rare choice to remain present when every reasonable person would have walked away. A year after the night Nathaniel Hale fell from the western dock, the household had settled into a life none of them could have predicted during those first terrible days of uncertainty. The black curtains once ordered for a funeral that never came had long since been returned. The company operated under a partnership none of their peers would have imagined possible a year earlier, built not on birthright or convenience, but on a devotion that had asked for nothing and in the end had been given everything. Eleanor Finch, once a scullery maid whose name few in the household had bothered to learn, now stood in the doorway of the same manor that had once told her she was not welcome to sit beside its dying master. She held in her hands, that afternoon, a signed partnership contract rather than a washing cloth, her name printed in the same bold ink as the family she had once served in silence. She did not know, standing there in the quiet afternoon light, whether the trembling in her hands came from disbelief at how far she had come, or from the memory of every long, uncertain night she had spent believing this outcome was impossible. Perhaps, she thought, it did not matter which. What mattered was that she had stayed, when staying had cost her everything she had to give, and that in the end it had been enough.